Let's get into some resources that I like a lot for writing fantasy. The first one is obviously all of the books that you love and enjoy. So for me, probably my biggest influence in this genre is, of course, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And my suggestion with the fantasy, he's often considered kind of the godfather of the whole fantasy thing. Actually, what happens a lot nowadays is that people will criticize works if they're too similar to Tolkien, because he set this whole thing kind of in motion of high fantasy and all of these, orcs and elves, all these things, that now if people do things too much like that, everything's kind of a derivative of that, and that gets criticized. So personally, I think that criticism is kind of silly because, again, it was kind of the beginning of this whole fantasy thing. But ultimately, I would suggest two things. I would suggest, one, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you need to, because I think if you want to understand something, it's very important to understand where it came from and where it started. So even if Lord of the Rings ends up not being for you and it ends up being something that you don't really care about in the long run, it's kind of a good history lesson to understand where this all started and where this came from. The next thing is just any of the stories that you love and like. So you can see back here on my bookshelf that I have all sorts of books. I got Wheel of Time here. I got a bunch of other stuff that is just fantasy things that as you read it shows you the different ways that you can change your story. And it's just great. If the best resource to me is reading. So read the books that you like. And then, of course, turn that into writing a story that you would read yourself. And the only way that you know how to write a story that you'd read yourself is by reading the stories that you like. The next set of resources that I would really heavily point you to are Brandon Sanderson's BYU lectures on YouTube. They're all up there for free. There's like 13, 14, 15 of them. And that number might not be right, but there's a lot of them. There's over 10. And they're all a few hours long. They've got lots of information. He goes from world building to character arcs to plotting to all sorts of things. And even if Brandon Sanderson's books are not necessarily something that you really like, because I've heard, a lot of people, they don't really care for his stories or anything. And a lot of people say maybe his prose isn't quite what they like or anything. All of that aside, these lectures are chocked full of information, and even if you don't follow them to a T or whatever, they should definitely kind of spark some stuff inside of you. So I would check those out. I would watch every single one, and they are just a super cool resource. And on top of all that, they're free. They're a free resource that you can get. You don't have to go buy a book. You don't have to go buy a course. You can get these for free on YouTube right now. Right after you get off of this, you can go watch one of those. So I would definitely check them out and devour them. Like, watch them over and over and over again. Take notes. It's a college course that he teaches once a year, I think. And so take it like a college course, write notes, all that kind of stuff. Definitely check it out. And the next kind of genre thing, this isn't really specific to fantasy, but any kind of writing book, any book about writing that is about writing fiction is going to help you in this area. So if you've never written anything before, I think maybe that's a great place to start, is just start getting into writing, just general writing books that kind of talk about plotting and character development, all those kinds of things. But ultimately, the culmination of all of these things where you're reading these fantastical books, because it's hard to come up with fantasy if you've never read anything that's fantasy before. And so you kind of gets you started. So I would read some fantasy, read some general books about writing and how to write and all that kind of thing. And then also those BYU lectures. I think between those three things, you're going to have a really great and solid start into writing your fantasy book in 2024.